In modern times, it's certainly assumed that reason and logic are the most accurate faculties for the exploration of the world and ourselves. And there is certainly undeniable utility in using these faculties to explore reality. Except we must recognize that they have limitations. We're going to talk about two limitations of rationality in this video. First is that rationality is actually something we impart onto the world. It's not something inherent in reality. In fact, the first people to claim that it was claimed that based on a religious belief that God was reasonable and rational and logical, so he created a universe that reflected that. The second reason that rationality does not rule is that the neuroscientific data is very clear. The brain's rational faculties are extremely susceptible to distortion, fabrication, denial, and outright delusion when not properly opposed by the more irrational functions of the brain. Before we get into number one, please consider subscribing as it helps a small channel like this. Let's begin with claim one. Rationality is something that we impart onto the world. We know that if the brain regions that mediate rationality are either temporarily deactivated or completely damaged, rationality takes on a different quality and is sometimes completely absent. Dreams are an excellent example of this. When the frontal cortex is deactivated, irrational events are able to take place. The frontal cortex also houses what is considered the cause and effect region of the brain. Essentially, it helps us evaluate things in a linear fashion. I don't want to get too deep into neuroscience. The main point I want to emphasize is that this ability to create cause and effect relationships and look at the world through this lens of rationality are something that we impart onto it. It's a way for us to categorize and organize it. Furthermore, these functions have an evolutionary purpose. And just like anything from an evolutionary perspective, it develops not in an objective manner. It simply develops because it was advantageous. The accepted theory for the development of cause and effect cognition is to evaluate the outcomes of our decisions before and after we make them. That way we can be better prepared for the future and also reflect on what went right or wrong in any given situation. It's also important to consider that during and throughout evolutionary history, as the brain evolves, certain physical changes occur no matter the organism. In relationship to the brain, these are increased frontal lobe size and density and increased hemispheric division. In other words, as organisms evolve, no matter what organism you are, you have a tendency to become rational and to look at the world through a cause and effect relationship. And humanity is a perfect example of how this gets taken to an extreme. And we know for a fact that this actually results in conclusions that are completely logically sound, but are nonetheless nonsensical. Paradoxes are a perfect example of when the brain's rational faculties clash with reality in an irreparable way. Zeno created many thought experiments. We're just going to focus on one, and it specifically involves motion and how he believed logically, as we'll get into, that motion was an illusion. So the paradox goes that in order to travel 100 meters, Zeno argued that one must first travel half of that distance. Then with the remaining 50 meters, one must also travel half of that distance. Then the remaining 25, you have to travel half of that, and so forth for eternity. And you can never actually reach the 100-meter mark because you always have another half of that distance to cover. Thus, he logically, using logic, and it's logically sound, that motion does not exist. This is a perfect example. Paradoxes are examples of how the brain can enter into these completely irresolvable conundrums due to its insistence on a certain rational perspective. The second point I want to mention in this video is that the brain's rational faculties are extremely susceptible to distortion, so much so that they call into question what reality even is. An example I've used on this channel before is eating disorders. Eating disorders exclusively exist in Western societies that have some kind of idealized beauty standard. In other words, they're entirely culturally conditioned. One of the characteristics of eating disorders is an inherent distortion of reality. Individuals will oftentimes look in the mirror and see a body that is heavier. This also bleeds into other senses such as proprioception, where the person will assume the posture of someone that is heavier and feel as if they inhabit a larger body, despite all of these things being completely culturally conditioned. Now imagine just for a brief second that humanity in general evolved to have an eating disorder. What would that do to our understanding of an objective reality? It would be distorted in some way. Now imagine us saying that about left hemisphere function. We're left hemisphere dominant. In an alternate universe, there's humans being like, imagine if we developed with left hemisphere dominance. It would completely change the nature of reality. The main point here that I want to emphasize is that internalized beliefs will change our perspective of reality. And specifically, they influence reality at a perceptual level. And this is because perception is not entirely based on the senses. It's not an objective piece of data. I like this example of there's no such thing as color. Color doesn't exist objectively. It's a ray of light that hits your retina. Your brain produces that color. And so your brain is really at the center of what it gets to determine is reality. Another example of a cultural belief that may influence our perception of reality is the concept of individuality. Some scholars have pointed out that as we see the emergence of individuality, we see people who are more attuned to others' individual differences, both in their beliefs, but also their physical appearance. Cultural beliefs impact us at a level that sometimes we're not even aware of. Egocentric cultures, like Western cultures, for example, perceive things differently than Eastern cultures, and the logical conclusions that are built off those perceptions are assumed to be true. But in reality, they're completely built on a faulty foundation. And here is an example of it. Here's an image of 3 dogs. One is clearly on the bed, and the question for you to consider is which dog is in front of the bed and which dog is behind the bed. And you can pause and think about it for a moment, but the chances are that this is quite obvious to you, that it comes very naturally. If you come from an egocentric Western culture, you assume that the frame of reference revolves around the perceiver. In this case, it's the person taking the image. For that reason, you assume that reality is facing you, because you are taking the position of the person perceiving the image. And for this reason, you have most likely concluded that the black dog is in front of the bed and that the white dog is behind the bed. When in reality, the bed has no inherent front or back to it. It is a symmetrical object. What you have done in that situation is that you have distorted, compartmentalized, and egocentrically constructed reality, and then made a conclusion based on these perceptions that perfectly coincided with logical reasoning. One might even say that it is objectively true that the German Shepherd is in front of the bed. However, in less egocentric cultures, they perceive reality facing away from them, and would then reach the exact opposite conclusion, that because the bed is facing the opposite direction, the white dog is in front and the black dog is behind. Now we can see that logical functions are something imparted onto reality. They're not something inherent to it. They are constructed out of an evolutionary preference for cause and effect reasoning. They're influenced by cultural beliefs. They're capable of directly conflicting with intuitive reality, and they are temporary in their duration and can be turned off at any time, such as during sleep. The point I'm trying to make throughout this video, and I will emphasize again, is that rationality has nothing to do with objective reality. Rather, it has everything to do with establishing a connection between sensory perception and internal beliefs. It's an attempt to make a coherent, logical, linear sequence of our lives, not an objective one. We are dealing here with a massive moving puzzle, where sensation is influenced by belief, and belief can influence sensation, and both are heavily influenced by evolutionary pressure, and then neither of which are connected to reality. But let me know what you think down in the comment section below. I think it's a very interesting topic and really destabilizes, I would say, most people's worldview. This is certainly a topic that I will come back to on this channel, so if you're interested in learning more about this, be sure to subscribe. I will see you on the next video.